However, from the 1890s up to the 20s, the East End was developed as a glamorous residential resort, with villas, guest houses and cafes being constructed.
When I was a little girl, I used to always have the band every Sunday on the top of the beach. And people would sit round and then they'd come in the little money boxes.
By the 30s, the streets housed working families in rows of terraces, and many of these dwellings still stand, saved from the developers by the Newcastle East Residents Group and the Trades Hall Council in the 70s. By the 50s, the word eyesore was being used constantly to describe the area. Newcastle East had for a long time been regarded as a rather sleazy, undesirable place to live. Its industrial functional role was never more evident than in those years when the powerhouse dominated the area and held up any interest in development of the East End.
And it was all the country people used to come down there and have holidays. It was quite reasonable, very reasonable. It's you know where they've started to excavate next door to a place that used to be a butcher shop. Next door to there, right there, it was a great big place. And then past there was a little row of cottages facing onto the park.
The demise of the guest houses, hotels and cafes during the 50s meant the loss of the East End as a resort area. And this decline continued through to the late 70s with the demolition of the residential flats, houses and shops around Pacific Park. Planned demolition of the Golden Sands Hotel and other shops, houses and residential flats around the present Pacific Park brought the dispute between residents and Newcastle City Council to a head.
I would like to see a plan implemented. There's been so much demand for the release of the East End land for going back over many, many years, and I did feel that now that it's been released, there was a real lethargy about getting on with the job of determining a plan for the area.
Do you think maybe you took them by surprise a little bit with releasing the land?
I think so.
Well, what kind of things would you like to see there now?
Well, I would like to see our land, 25 to 30 acres, incorporated in an overall plan for the area, and the city has a much larger area there to develop. Mr. Fife is endeavouring to get rid of the Zara Street power station, and we don't expect wonders overnight. This is a plan that will be implemented between now and the turn of the century. But instead of talking, I think we do need some plans in the very near future.
From the early 50s up to the 1980s, there were so many successive plans for the East End to become a showplace for the city that one finds it difficult to follow. Varying approaches were taken by planners to considerations such as height, density, zoning and attitudes towards the residents. This resulted in markedly different development plans, all of which were considered to be most beneficial to Newcastle East. The Newcastle East Residents Group was formed to be the people's voice in the ensuing battles with council and developers. When you did your survey going around the East End, they were quite shocked by what was planned for the East End?
Oh, quite shocked, and they had no previous knowledge that those plans were even in the pipeline, and they were plans for major redevelopment of this area, but more to the point, what was more threatening to the residents was that they involved the demolition of a great deal of the housing stock that existed at that time. And inspections had been made, and lots of people were upset about that process occurring without any involvement on the part of the residents in those decisions. And the reason we actually did the survey was not only to find out what people thought about those plans for redevelopment, but it was also a way of informing people about what was proposed. And at that stage it was decided that a new group needed to be formed up here in the Newcastle East area to address the issues that were being raised by that planning.
Well, when this is all packed up and handed over to council, how long is it going to take them to consider it, or when do they consider it?
Well, we will submit our final report by the end of this month, and the basic exercise from now on, as far as we're concerned, is to report. We'll evaluate all the alternatives and firm up on basic recommendations on one.
Newcastle East Residents Group commissioned Alan Butler, an architecture student, to devise a people's plan which could preserve the East End as a recreation area as well as preserve its historic character.
When we first came up here, the powerhouse was there, and people that lived with it sort of be there all the time for the electricity of it. And we used to get a lot of dust and soot and things like that, but just sort of put up with it in those days.
Regarded by many as the main obstacle to beautification of the Newcastle Harbour foreshore, the powerhouse, which was built in 1927, was finally demolished in 1978. The vacant land now forms part of the Bicentennial Housing Commission project.
I'd naturally like to think that we would have been able to just continue on the way we are with what we've got around us, but we have to accept progress. With progress there is change.
It wasn't until the mid and the late 70s that we started to realise that we're really just destroying our past, and we started to have more of a feeling for trying to keep our heritage values. And some of these heritage values that we're looking at in terms of buildings are not things of national significance, they're things of local significance, but they're important to the local area.
Do you think the show will have much relevance to other communities?
Well, in its imagery, it is very specific to the East End of Newcastle, but as a basic idea of following up or exploring a transition period in a community, I think it could be quite relevant to other communities.